like to introduce Sarah Lancaster. She's the extension weed specialist out of Manhattan. And she's gonna talk to us today. And I guess we got at least one subject that's pretty new that you're gonna talk about with the court ruling.
The court ruling. Oh,
Yeah. At least we don't have any beans up here, so.
I didn't know I was gonna need to speak lawyer when I took this job. Turns out. So thanks, Aaron, and thanks guys for coming out tonight. We got really creative with our title this year for the talk for the weed schools, managing troublesome weeds in Kansas. So, all right, so I've got kind of 4 bullet points here. There we go. We're going to do a little bit of a herbicide update. We're going to do a little bit of a resistance update, and then we'll transition into talking a little bit about strategic tillage. There's some newer data starting to come around to inform some of these decisions around strategic tillage. So we're gonna talk about that tonight. Before I jump, every other clicker I use, guys, the top button is the laser. On this one, it's the off switch. So we'll see how fast I can be retrained. Before I get started, though, I do want to make sure that everyone is aware of the fact that we have a new extension weed scientist on board. His name is Jeremy Kawami. I struggle a little bit to get my Missouri accent to pronounce that name correctly. But he started at the beginning of January and he's getting his feet under him. My read on Jeremy is he's going to be a great team player, going to be a great asset to folks in this part of the world. He's going to want to do things well and do things to serve you guys. So he's in Hayes. I left that part out, didn't I? He's located in Hayes. And so, like I said, he'll be a great resource. He's mostly research, but does have some extension responsibilities. So super excited. Next year, there'll be 2 faces on the program instead of 1 faculty member. But I sound like I just totally discounted Jay. Jay is amazing. And he'll introduce himself later on this evening. So Aaron made reference to this. I'm sure you guys have all seen this all over the news. Quite frankly, folks, at this point, there are still more unknowns than there are knowns in terms of what actually is going to happen. What we do know is that the court in Arizona ruled that the EPA violated some of the comment period requirements associated in FIFRA. So FIFRA is the Federal Insecticide, Fungicide, and Rodenticide Act. Been on the books since the late 1940s. That's the law that allowed the federal government to register herbicides, okay? If I were to say there's a silver lining in some of this, I think it's the fact that the court did not find the EPA to be in violation of any of their obligations under the Endangered Species Act. We're going to see a lot of changes probably starting next year in herbicide labels to make sure the EPA is in compliance with the Endangered Species Act. I think the fact that these dicamba labels were not in violation of ESA suggests that the courts might think that maybe the EPA is going to be in compliance there. Okay, you hear all the think, might, maybe, it's all still pretty murky. Okay, so other things we know, the court basically issued a vacatur of these labels, which is essentially what they did in June of 2020. Okay, so basically these labels don't exist at the moment. The EPA could take a lot of different approaches in their response to this court decision, one of which would be to allow for the use of existing stocks, which basically means if folks have herbicide in their possession, they can use it. Okay, we don't know if that's what they're going to do. We don't know if the courts will let them do that. Okay, so it's all, I was actually on a panel with Ed Messina, who is the director of the Office of Pesticide Programs for the EPA last week. So this announcement came out Tuesday. I was talking with Ed on Thursday. The only thing Ed would say is there was a court ruling. My understanding is it's all still in the hands of the EPA lawyers. And I know that the commodity groups were all over this one. I had emails from the cotton folks less than 12 hours, less than 18 hours after I got the announcement about the ruling. So the companies are working on it, the EPA is working on it. We just need to wait and see what's gonna happen.
So Sarah, is
Yes,
it
ma'am.
only those 3 herbicides that are listed up here?
Right, it's just these 3, Extendamax, Ingenia, and Tavium. It's just those ones that are labeled for over the top of soybeans and cotton. And that's been, part of the kind of the rub in the ag community this whole time is how can these 3 products have all these different use patterns and requirements where our other formulations don't. So it is just those 3. So my thought, my dad is a soybean farmer in Missouri who plants XtendFlex soybeans. So I've thought about this a little bit, guys. My thought is it's not time to switch out of the system at this point, probably. We need to see what the courts are going to do. I think it is an appropriate time for folks to start thinking about what's the worst case scenario. Okay, so to me, worst case scenario is EPA says you could use existing stocks. The environmental groups then countersue or appeal. And so then we end up with one of these May or June types of decisions again. We've already got beans in the ground, right? So if I'm a farmer, I'm thinking through these worst case scenarios. How can I protect myself and what kind of plans do I need to have in place if we find ourselves there? So, nothing new here, beefing up residual programs. So thinking about beefing up those layered residuals. And the flex system, right? Folks are going to be depending on Liberty. I know that that's not a common practice out here, but there's not a lot of beans out here anyway. But Liberty, which really means weed size and spray volume, become very important. One other thing that I find interesting is that there is some evidence in the literature that when we apply PPO inhibiting herbicides, so group 14 herbicides like Reflex with Liberty, we see a little bit of synergy there sometimes. So been encouraging folks to think about how can we maximize some of those applications that way. The folks I'm worried about are the few folks that are in Extend only, not the Extend Flex, because they essentially have no effective post-emergence herbicides in that system, right? Because they've got resistance to dicamba and glyphosate in the beans. So really they've got group 14 herbicides, which are not the most effective products on the market for palmer amaranth and water hemp. Okay. One thought that has come to my mind is that if we find ourselves in the situation, we're gonna need to kind of look at what creative options we have for maybe utilizing hooded sprayers and things of that nature if the beans haven't canopied yet at that point. So that's kind of how I'm thinking about this. But again, I do think the timing is better than the last time this happened. Obviously, it would have been better if it had been in November, October instead of February, but February is better than June. So we're at least moving things in the right direction, I think. The other EPA related or regulatory related label change we need to look at is the fact that the companies that had atrazine that was labeled for use for fall applications, that was all allowed under what's called a special local needs label. And basically that's an extra label that the state approves on top of the national label. Okay, and so what has happened is the registrants, the companies have decided not to pursue those extra labels for the state of Kansas going forward. So this is the language off of the Atrex herbicide label. Okay, so basically it's saying the only place that we're allowed fall applications of atrazine now are in chem fallow systems. Okay, so only apply to fallow land according to the rotation pattern below. So wheat, corn, fallow, wheat, wheat, sorghum, fallow. So the fallow phase is where we're limited now to using fall applications of atrazine. Okay.
What is fall?
What is fall? That's a great question. And I'm not trying to be flippant here, but I would tell you that early spring pre-plant burn down applications are not fall. Does that help? Ish, a little? Mhm.
One application per year. Like that early spring burn down. What's in that? Spike up a little bit.
So that though would be not in the fallow phase, right? One application in the fallow phase. Yep, one application in fallow, and then you can still use it in the corn and the sorghum, right?
Well, stalks are in fallow. We should have sprayed last fall.
Corn stalks that you're gonna fallow, because you get one shot at a fallow application, so it would either be,
Has to be in fall.
no, just in the fallow. Mhm. Yep, if you're ahead of your milo or your corn, yeah. Yep.
Fallow.
Oh. One application in the fallow. You could still do it, yeah, yep. So regulations, EPA, thanks for clarifying that, yeah, that's good. Okay. Other questions about that? All right. So we're gonna transition from talking about atrazine by itself to talking about corn herbicides. And one of the things I want to point out with these corn herbicides, so the newer products, Storin, Maverick, Trivolt, you guys I'm sure have noticed they don't contain atrazine, right? So we're adding our chosen rate of atrazine to those tank mixes when we apply those products. And a lot of that is having to do with anticipating needing more flexibility with when and where and how we apply atrazine. One of the things we're going to see happen as these labels become ESA compliant is restrictions based on slope, soil texture, things of that nature. So where we would really like to go in and say our corn program is going to be a pound of atrazine at planting and a pound of atrazine early, or a pound of atrazine burn down and a pound of atrazine at V2 corn. It's not going to there's a high probability that you could have to adjust that from field to field across your operation. Does that make, in order to be compliant with the label? Does that make sense? Soil texture, slope, the one like field property that is consistent, it looks like they're going to use I-35 as kind of an east-west dividing line. And so folks west of I-35 get a little more flexibility because there's less rainfall compared to folks east of I-35. But yes, slope and soil texture will be the big ones that are properties of the field. Everything else is going to be based around conservation practices primarily. There are some application characteristics. So one of those is going to be to use the lowest effective rate of the herbicide, which totally goes against everything we've been talking about for resistance management, right? So it's going to get harder to be in compliance with the labels going forward, but that's another one of those things where the ESA is being kind of mum. They've put out some information and they're kind of dribbling out a few more press releases here, but they have to have their final plan published. Their herbicide action plan is what they're calling it. They have to have the final plan published in May. But even then, last week they were talking like basically every label they put out, every comment period that happens, they're going to take that feedback and incorporate it into the next label that they write and the next comment period they have. So they are viewing this as a a process and a transition where I think we're gonna have some moving targets for a while to come in terms of making sure that the EPA doesn't get sued by the environmental groups. I mean, basically is what this is about. So now, storing. We do have one new corn product in the weed guide this year. It is called Storin. It's a Syngenta product. Have you guys seen this yet? Heard about this from your retailers at all? Okay, so basically Storin is very similar to Acuron. My understanding from conversations with Syngenta is that they're sort of positioning this as if you're no longer satisfied with how Acuron is performing, this is the product that they would like to slide people over to. Okay, so sort of a souped up Acuron, so to speak. So if you break it down, bicyclopyrone is a bleaching herbicide that is a component of Acuron. It's used by itself in like vegetable crops, but we don't have any products in the agronomic world that use it by itself. Callisto, Zidua, and then Dual. So in our studies at Ashland and Manhattan, Zidua is the most consistent of those group 15 herbicides in terms of providing good palmer amaranth control across a variety of environments. So I'm kind of excited to see that addition to this product. I think you guys will like that aspect of this product. As far as pigweed control in Manhattan, we looked at 2 rates, 2.1 quarts and 2.4 quarts of Storin against some of the competitive products. So Resicor, Trivolt, and then Maverick, all of those had 3/4 pound of atrazine with them. Statistically, everything was the same. Okay, so we got good pigweed control with all of those products and our conditions in Manhattan. Okay. Questions about Storin?
More than Zidua need more moisture for us out here.
So Zidua needs a little less moisture than Dual, but more than like a harness type, than an acetochlor type of product. So you got the Callisto, which doesn't need a lot of moisture to get activated, is it for residual activity, and then pyroxasulfone would be the next, and then Dual would probably be the most. So yeah, that's fair. So I would say, I don't know. Initially, I got the impression they were going to price this kind of like a premium product, but I've been hearing rumblings that maybe they've got some incentives trying to get folks to try it this year. So I'm not sure exactly how that'll play out in the marketplace. But yeah, Zidua is going to need more water than like an acetochlor type of product. The other product that we added to the weed guide this year is called Tarzec. It's a Corteva product for wheat. A lot of the new Corteva products in wheat have been built around this haloxyphen active ingredient, which is the active ingredient in Elevore. So Elevore is primarily a burn down product, good activity on horseweed. Okay. It does have some activity on mustards and some other winter annual broadleaf weeds. In my studies, I had a good population of downy brome. So I've got some data on brome activity here. And basically, here's Tarzec. Well, let me back up a minute. So it's this Elevore component and then PowerFlex. Okay, so PowerFlex is what's bringing the cheat activity, the downy brome activity. So we've got Tarzec here, really excellent downy brome control. And it's similar to any of the other products mixed with PowerFlex. Okay, so PowerFlex is carrying the weight there on the brome control. I have sprayed this on mustards, but to be honest, it was a late application. And so I got the control that you would expect with a late application. It is labeled though for control of appropriately sized mustards.
Sarah, when you see late, had it bolted?
Yeah, it had bolted. And so the control was hit and miss and generally not very good. I have not sprayed it on rosettes. Questions about those products? I did get a call today. BASF has a label for a new product called, oh my goodness. BAS has a label for a new burn down product. It's built on Sharpen, but it has an additional component to it. We will add that to the weed guide next year. It's not going to be necessarily in a lot of marketing or distribution channels this year, but it is labeled. So we are starting to see some more new products come out. So if there's no other questions about labels, let's talk about herbicide resistance. So I've been kind of updating and building these kind of scorecards for the different weeds in terms of herbicide resistance. So just keeping track of the number of officially reported cases and when and where they're reported and when we first found them in Kansas. So the thing I want to draw your attention to on this list for Palmer amaranth is this third line from the bottom, the group 4 herbicides, 2,4-D and dicamba. I'm going to wager to bet that if I asked you, you guys would all say that dicamba is not doing what it did 10 years ago for pigweed control. Fair? Okay. We've been saying that and hearing that and knowing that for a while. It was just in 2021, actually, that Bayer confirmed a case of dicamba-resistant Palmer amaranth that came out of Kansas. So they found this population as part of their required, response to complaints, right? The EPA says the company has to screen for herbicide resistance when they get complaints. So they found this population in 2021. The only things that I can say about this population, the only things that I've been told about this population is that it's resistant. They collected the seed from a cornfield under irrigation near Colby. Okay, so that's starting to hit pretty close to home for you guys, right? So something definitely to be watching carefully for. Okay. Other things that I would like to draw your attention to on this chart would be the next line down, the group 15 herbicides. So that's our Zidua products, our duals, our acetochlor products. We have not confirmed a population resistant to those products in Kansas yet. Jeremy, actually, the new weed scientist at Hayes, worked with some of those populations in Arkansas for his PhD work. So he's got some experience in that area, which I think will serve us well in Kansas. One of the things I've been saying is that my instinct is that we probably have some populations that just haven't surfaced yet that are resistant to dual, in particular, group 15 herbicides in general. So my request of you guys is that as you're checking fields, working with your scouts, what have you, if you have a field that you think your pigweeds might be resistant to these group 15 herbicides, let Aaron or Jeannie or someone know so that we can work together to start to map where some of these populations are located. Because to me, not having a good understanding of where these populations are is sort of like trying to go to battle without knowing who the enemy is, right? So the more we know about where these populations are, the better off we're going to be as a Kansas ag community, right? So now you need to ask, okay, Sarah, what does resistance to a group 15 herbicide look like? We've all been pretty well trained on how to spot things like dicamba resistance, right? You see that lone survivor around the plants that are dead. With residual herbicides, what we're looking for is basically a shorter period of weed control. So if you make an application of acetochlor and you've been living right, and you get that, quarter, half inch of rain, and you have it activated well, but you only see 3 weeks of activity, or you only see 14 days of activity, and you start to see escapes, those are the fields we want to look at. Okay. Basically, it's just a shorter period of weed control when all else suggests that you should have good activity. So like I said, reach out to Jeannie, reach out to Aaron. Jay is in the room or was in the room. He's an agent east of here. because I think we need to have a good network of folks that are working together to make sure we know exactly what it is we're dealing with. So,
We don't actually tell where we find them.
no,
I mean, we're not gonna go tell neighbors, you're the one who
No.
called us and said, hey.
no, your landlords will not know, your neighbors will not know. Yeah, I mean, so yeah, it's a balance, right, between confidentiality and working together, and we are respectful of that for sure. So, we won't talk about Liberty. In this case, I am including this water hemp slide just to kind of carry on the scorecard theme here for the whole state and to show you guys we are investigating a population of water hemp that we think is probably resistant. We haven't gone through all the testing steps to confirm it. And we've been in communication with BASF and looking at some of their test results, but it's starting to walk like a duck and quack like a duck in our greenhouse evaluations. So what this slide is showing, here's the non-treated of the field collected population. The bottom is showing the non-treated of the susceptible. On the right-hand side, we sprayed 2 quarts of Liberty. 21 days after application, the known susceptible population was dead. The suspected population, we had regrowth in nearly every plant that we sprayed. If we had checked these plants 7 days, 5 or 7 days after we sprayed, if I had had that photo, it would look pretty good. But what happens is you get to that, 2-week, 15, 16-day mark, and you start to see the new leaves coming out, right? And then the next thing you know, those buds have turned into a bush. So I show you this just to say, Palmer amaranth isn't the only weed we're looking at. These 2 plants are very closely related. And this water hemp plant actually came into my lab mixed up with a bunch of Palmer that was collected from the same field. The Palmer was still sensitive to Liberty, but they were all mixed in together. Okay, the last weed that I have a scorecard for here is kochia. So same system. What I want you to see on this kochia slide, though, is that our friends in North Dakota have identified multiple populations of kochia that are resistant to PPO inhibiting herbicides. I always feel like I'm maybe giving Jeannie flashbacks to her master's program when I talk about PPO resistance. But they found throughout large swaths of the state. So the academic folks at NDSU have got about 6 populations that they're working with, and their counterparts with BASF have been working with a handful of additional populations. So it's very widespread up there. These are some of their greenhouse studies, and the story that I need to tell you guys, you can see here in these first 2 rows of pots. So the bottom left-hand corner, that's their non-treated check. They're getting good activity out of the diphenyl ether herbicides. That's a subgroup of those PPO inhibiting herbicides that I kind of think about as being post material for soybeans. Okay, not great pigweed control, but they're doing a good job of controlling this kochia population. Now remember, this is post-emergence activity here, but here's our Spartan and Valor pots. Okay, so 70% control if I were to evaluate that, somewhere in that ballpark. Here's Sharpen and Reviton and Vita. These are all 3 also in a family together. I would call that 10% control, right? That's essentially a failure. Okay. In fact, they went ahead and they've done the tests to confirm resistance in these populations. They had a couple of populations where they had survivors of a 100 times the labeled rate dose of Sharpen. I believe that would be 100 fluid ounces. I think they were looking at the 1 ounce rate as their labeled rate. 100x, okay? This is the slide actually that has me the most concerned. So in this case, they're looking at soil activity. Okay, so in these pots, they filled the pots with soil, and they soaked them and got them wet. They planted the seeds, they sprinkled some soil on top, they sprayed, and then they watered in the herbicide. Okay, so they tried to simulate field conditions under which the kochia would be emerging in the herbicide. Okay, so this is again about 3 weeks after they sprayed. Here's their 6 populations on the bottom untreated. So 3 replications of each of their 6 resistant populations plus a susceptible. Okay. The middle chunk, the middle block, this is their Spartan treated plants. Okay. Here's the susceptible check over here on the far right. But the one that got my attention was the Valor treatment. Okay. They essentially had no control residual activity with this Valor treatment. And that's consistent. I mean, you can see that's consistent across all 6 of those populations that they were looking at. Okay.
You say when this was applied, when the plants were up? Or
Before. So like within a day, they wetted the soil in the pots, they got the soil wet. They put the seeds on there, they sprinkled a little bit of soil on top, and then they sprayed. So right as soon as they put the seeds in, they sprayed. So no chance for germination before they sprayed. So I wanted to talk a little bit about why we care about this finding. Obviously, if I had to guess, I would guess a lot of folks in this room are using a lot of Valor or one of the generic equivalents, flumiaxazine. Is that a fair assessment or fair assumption? Okay. But you're not depending on that Valor by itself to control kochia, right? You're probably putting out with some atrazine, dicamba products as well. Okay. Yeah. So here's why we care. I'm going to set this up by telling you this is a study that was done in Europe. They have about 75 different fields that they were looking at, and they were looking at black grass control. Black grass is to wheat in Europe as palmer amaranth is to corn in Kansas. It is the weed that is eating their lunch in terms of herbicide resistance. Okay. So what they're looking at here is how effective is mixing and rotating herbicides at delaying herbicide resistance. Okay, so we've got to set the stage a little bit more here. You guys remember we've talked in some extension presentations about the difference between target site resistance and metabolic resistance. Target site resistance is that really specific resistance that comes as a result of changing the enzyme where the herbicide attacks the plant. Okay, it develops relatively quickly. It's kind of when we talk about glyphosate resistance and that very typical surviving plant surrounded by the dead ones, that's what we're talking about is target site resistance. Okay, so they looked at what percentage of the plants they sampled had target site resistance based on the number of herbicides that were in the application. So you can see it's just a 1 to 2 scale, okay? But you can see they looked at sulfonylurea herbicides, so ALS inhibiting herbicides, the FOPs, that's like Assure, one group of the grass killing herbicides. And then the DIMs would be the other family of the grass herbicides. So that's like Select. Okay, so 3 different herbicide families here. And consistently, we saw a decrease in the development of target site resistance. Okay, good news. When you guys follow the recommended practices, we're slowing down the development of target site resistance. The less good news is that it doesn't work for metabolic resistance. Okay, so metabolic resistance is resistance that is a result of how the weeds break down the herbicides. So really what it comes down to in the plant is an increase in this specific type of enzyme that takes the herbicide apart. GSTs is what we call those herbicides, okay? So they measured the amount of GST in the blackgrass plants, and then they compared that against the number of herbicides, the number of modes of action in their applications versus overall modes of action in the cropping system. So comparing mixing herbicides to rotating herbicides, basically, is what they're doing here. I would suggest to you that there is no difference in the slope of those two lines. Okay, so metabolic herbicide is what we need to be on the lookout for. We're starting to see more of this, particularly in populations that are resistant to multiple herbicides. It doesn't develop as fast, but it's harder to detect. It looks like that rate creep that we talked about earlier, right? Because you get just a little less control, just a little less control, just a little less control, and then you've got nothing, okay? So metabolic resistance is the thing that kind of keeps weed scientists up at night, right? Thinking about how are we going to manage this problem. I wanted to try to visualize some of this just a little bit differently. And so what I did, how many of you guys have seen the take action charts? The herbicide charts? So Jeannie, I have to confess to you, before Christmas, I emailed the powers that be that are in charge of the chart. They're going to have them ready for Commodity Classic in a couple of weeks. Thank you. That does us no good. So we will get those updated charts for 2024 out to you guys, but they haven't been printed yet. They're going to go to Houston first before they come to Atwood, Kansas. So these colors correspond with that chart. I looked at corn, which you can't see under Jeannie's picture up there is corn. And I broke the herbicides down into ones that have activity pre-emergence to the weeds versus post-emergence to the weeds. Okay, so some of these on this post-emergence side are going to kill your corn if you spray them on your corn. I'm focused on the weeds, okay? And then I went through and tried to highlight the herbicides that have resistance concerns, okay? So for example, let's look at the group 15 block. I underlined dual because we know that Palmer amaranth in Arkansas has resistance to dual. We know there are populations of Palmer amaranth that have developed resistance to prowl. Okay, so I underline those because we should be watching those and be concerned about those. You see here, atrazine is white. We've documented post-emergence resistance to atrazine, but not pre-emergence resistance to atrazine. So atrazine is one we need to be watching, right? Similar for Callisto and Balance, okay? So I just tried to highlight the ones that were of concern. The other thing that you might ask when you look at this slide is if you've got your magnifying glass down on Aaron's handouts there, these italicized words, those italicized words are the herbicide families. So extension specialists have been talking to you guys about know your herbicide mode of action, group 15, group 4. We talk about it like we have some kind of club and it's our secret password, right? Bad news is metabolic resistance means that knowing the site of action, while it's very important for managing target site resistance, tells us nothing about managing metabolic resistance, okay? We're probably going to start talking a little bit more about these different families of herbicides because the families are organized not by where they affect the plants, about what building blocks are in that molecule. Okay, and the individual building blocks in the molecule are what is important for metabolic resistance. There are certain, the term is functional groups, there's certain building blocks on the herbicides that are the target of those GST enzymes to break down. So we're looking for those particular building blocks. And so they're more common, there's more commonality among the herbicide families in that regard. So I tried to make it colorful. I tried to make it informative. What I want you to see here is that there is only one of these hexagons that has no other concerns in it, and that is this flumioxazin or Valor as a burn down or early pre-plant type of application for corn. Every other hexagon on this slide has some reason why we should be concerned about using that product. And I'm not telling you that to tell you to go use Valor every day. I'm telling you that because we're using a lot of Valor, a lot of flumioxazin, and there's a high probability that it will be the next one to go, not only in kochia, but also in our pigweeds. Okay. I don't know if I should try to make the group laugh or if I should I feel like I just ran over everybody's dog, Chidi, but it's more serious than that. So eat, drink, and be merry, right? All right. So this is nothing new. We've been talking for a long time about the importance of integrated management. So you guys know cultural practices, right? Anything we can do to get shade, to quote my friend, Dr. Curry, dark is a good herbicide, right? Chemical control. I talk a lot about non-chemical options, but chemical control for my career is going to be the most efficient way to kill weeds, right? There's those ones that we watch out for, the pigweeds, but by and large, chemical control is going to be the backbone of our our large-scale agriculture weed management systems. Biological control, we're starting to see an uptick in interest in various companies and biocontrol for weeds again. Is, you know, I would assume the thinking is there's more interest in what's happening in the soil. We have better tools to study these bacteria and such. So maybe now is the time to find some biocontrols. Prevention, quite frankly, is probably one of the most economically practical weed management tools that we have, but also the one that takes the most discipline to do, right? And so this is one we probably should talk about more often, sort of, please don't judge me harshly when I say this, but sort of along the lines of me telling my 9-year-old he needs to go pick up his dirty socks, right? Sometimes we need those reminders because we're busy doing the things that matter, right? The one we're going to talk on for the rest of the night, and I need to move on here, mechanical control, okay? We're going to focus on strategic tillage, but I will tell you, if you go to the scientific meetings, mechanical control is where much of the non-chemical control research is focused, whether that be things like seed mills, impact mills, or lasers, or directed energy. So using specific wavelengths of light to keep seeds from germinating, to basically kill the weed seeds in the soil. So I think we will start to see some things come at least closer to being marketable in that space in the not too distant future. We'll have to get our hands on them and test them and see how they fit for us. But I think there will be some movement in that space. So this is some work that we did looking at strategic tillage, essentially for tumble windmill grass control. So most of you guys probably know tumble windmill grass. It's a native plant, so it belongs here, which is one of the reasons why it's so darn difficult to get rid of. One of the other reasons you guys have seen it, you know, it has really small leaves that are folded over, so not much surface area to take in our post-emergence herbicides. And then it is a tumbleweed. Those panicles, those seed heads break off and roll around, right? And so it has a really excellent seed dispersal mechanism. Folks have been working to try to control tumble windmill grass for a number of years. This research was done in the early 2000s. And the takeaway from this slide is basically that when we have seedling tumble windmill grass, we can kill it, okay, with all the usual suspects. However, when we have more mature plants, when we have those clumps, right, that's when we start to have problems. So this graph is set up a little bit reverse. It's looking at the number of tillers. So a small number is good. A small bar in this case is good. So you can see seedlings, they got good control, but when you move out here to tumble windmill grass that is headed out, they got poor control with glyphosate, post, select, and assure. I included this data set because when I found the thesis, it kind of is one of the things that triggered my thought on the study that I'm going to show you guys that my team put out. So this is from a thesis that was done at K-State, and they looked at the timing of application in terms of season. This is another graph that's set up sort of backwards where the small bar is good. They were looking at total ground cover of the windmill grass. So we want a small bar. So the gold bars are correlated with a springtime application. So this data suggests that in turf grass, the best time to try to chemically control tumble windmill grass is in the spring. And if we think about kind of perennial weed management 101, that makes some sense, right? That plant is trying to recover from the winter, regrow. It's moving any reserves that it had out and into the leaves. And so if we burn those leaves off, it doesn't have much to regrow from. Okay, so that's logical and makes good sense. So that spring application is something to consider. The other bit of research that we need to talk about to set the stage here is this study that Agostino Bohr did at Hayes. They were actually trying to evaluate soil health parameters in these different tillage, long-term tillage systems. I'm not qualified to talk to you guys tonight about soil health. My weed scientist version of those results is that there were very minimal changes in the soil health values that they were measuring, regardless of what tillage system they used. So that to me says the likelihood of undoing, right? That's one of the pushbacks we get when we start talking about strategic tillage, right? I'm going to undo 10 or 15 or 20 years worth of no-till effort in terms of building my soil. This study suggests that the reductions are minimal or the changes are minimal, okay? That's an Augustine story though, to tell you all the details. What I was interested in are these weed counts that they did. So the dominant weed that they were measuring here was tumble windmill grass. They also had some 3-on and some kochia in the mix as well. And you can see there are three treatments. They had a no-till treatment, a strategic tillage treatment, which was basically implemented because they were about to lose their no-till treatments to the windmill grass. And then this reduced tillage treatment, which was like the original pairing was no-till and reduced till, okay? So weed counts, they had a wheat fallow system, a wheat sorghum fallow system, and then a continuous wheat system. And the takeaway here is that whether they were doing strategic tillage or reduced tillage, they saw reductions in the amount of tumble windmill grass in those plots. So strategic tillage, and that's been the recommendation from Lucas and Jeannie, my understanding for a long time, right? Is tillage is a good way to disrupt the root system and try to get rid of this weed. So the study that my crew did, we did this study just east of here just east of Hayes by Russell, okay? We were in a conventionally tilled field that had tumble windmill grass coming in from the road ditch. Okay, it's right along the interstate. Everybody loves having research plots on a highway field, right? So conventionally tilled sorghum residue. We had 2 tillage treatments. We had a no-till treatment, and then the farmer used their sweet plow, just what they normally would have done in late April. okay, almost May. We came back about a month later, and we sprayed Roundup, Select, Callisto. Callisto was the herbicide that they were evaluating in that turf grass study. Impact, and then we looked at Sinnate. And Sinnate was of interest because AMVAC has got a section 3EE is a type of label. It's like a recommendation. It's kind of a label supplement that's basically a recommendation to use Sinnate for windmill grass control in corn. Okay, so we sprayed those after we tilled and then rated roughly every month. Okay, got to recognize Mr. Dinkle there, got the county agent involved. So this data set is looking at percent control. I want to focus on the 12-week after treatment data point. And this is looking at averaged over the tillage systems, but split out for the herbicides. So the best herbicides were either Select or Sinnate. When we looked at the herbicides by themselves, Select or Sinnate. When we averaged over the herbicides and looked at the effect of the tillage system, I didn't get my stars on this graph, but we did see statistical differences. That gray bar, even though it's not stellar control, it's higher control than we saw in the no-till system. Okay, so that's averaged over all the herbicides. When we look at the interaction of tillage and herbicide, so here we've got the no-till treatments and the sweep plow treatments, and then the stars indicate those are all the same. Okay, those tall bars are all the same. So the Select statistically was similar in both treatments. The Roundup was better in the tillage treatment. The Impact was better in the tillage treatment, and the Sinnate was better in the tillage treatment. Okay, so the takeaway here is that these herbicides performed better when we disturbed the plants, gave it a little bit of a chance to regrow, and then hit it again with the herbicides. So again, thinking about just when we teach the principles of managing perennial weeds, it's all about disrupting how much energy they can send down to the roots. So we got the plants after the winter, so it was using root reserves to regrow. We stopped that with the tillage, and then we came back, and as it was reestablishing and regrowing after the tillage, we hit it with the herbicides. And so that kind of triple play there gives us a little bit better control. Again, 80% 3 months after is really, I don't know if that's something to write home about or not, but it's definitely better than, 20%. These are some photos from that September rating date. So you can see this is the non-treated strip between our plots here. So you can see what we were dealing with in terms of almost a sod of tumble windmill grass. So here's our no-till Select treatment, our Select following the sweep plow, and then the Sinnate following the sweep plow. So I think we were able to kind of move those patches in the right direction with those treatments. So then the next question we ask is, how does this affect yield? I talked about the study from Hayes where they showed the soil health measurements were not greatly affected, but John Holman at Garden City and Lucas and others have been working on a long-term study again. They have a location at Tribune and a location at Garden City. We're going to focus this evening on the data coming out of Tribune. Okay. Here are their treatments. They're in a wheat sorghum fallow rotation. They've got a no-till treatment. They have 2 treatments that are a single tillage pass, 1 pass right before you plant the wheats, 1 pass after wheat harvest. Okay, so those are the 2 options for the 1 tillage pass systems. Then they have a couple of systems that have 2 tillage passes. And they don't have as much data on these 2 tillage pass systems yet. They've only got 1 cycle through the rotation, for these 2-pass systems. So the choices here are 2 tillage operations during fallow, or a tillage during fallow, and then a tillage after wheat harvest. So 5 different treatments there. So these next 2 slides, I've basically, thanks to Jeannie here, have got 4 data tables that are essentially set up more or less the same. If you want to dig into more information on this, you can use your phone and grab a picture of that QR code and it'll open up the website for you. But what we have here, table 1, this is the wheat yield. Okay, wheat yield comparing no-till to those 2 single tillage event treatments. They've got 8 years of data here. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. I'm sorry, 9. I can't count. 9 years of data here. So that's 3 trips through that rotation. Okay. When they run the stats, they've got no statistical differences for each individual year. But when you average across all 9 years, the no-till treatment does yield 2 bushels an acre more than those single tillage pass treatments. So we did see a yield hit with those 2 treatments. Now here are the grain sorghum yields. So same 3 treatments, same 9 years. Again, we saw greater grain sorghum yields in the no-till compared to those 2 single tillage pass treatments. But the other thing to point out here, guys, is that there were a couple of years where there were differences within that particular year. So the wheat yields were more consistent, fewer differences within, no differences within each given year, but accumulated over time, there were some long-term differences.
You know, you said on the but was there a cost per acre breakdown in those studies where they got the revenue per acre?
They have,
I don't think there's, I haven't seen economics, but.
yeah. I've seen other of the long-term studies where Lucas has done economics, but not this one. So I would assume that will probably come at some point, but we don't have it yet. Yeah. And then these 2 tables include those 2 pass systems. So here's the 2 tillage events during the fallow phase, and then here's the 1 in fallow and 1 after wheat. Okay, so again, we've really just got 1 kind of trip through the rotation here for these data points. So we would expect to see fewer differences here than we did in the other data set that has more data points. Okay. So no differences in the wheat yields among any of those 5 treatments, either for individual years or when they averaged them. Okay, so the wheat did not respond differently in those 3 years. When we look at the grain sorghum, though, those 2 treatments that included tillage after the wheat, those were the 2 treatments where we saw reduced yields. So the no-till treatment and the tillage during fallow statistically were the same when they averaged them over those years, but the 2 treatments where they tilled after the wheat were lower. So the take home here is that if you choose to utilize strategic tillage, the time to do it is during fallow, not after wheat harvest. We want to keep that wheat stubble in place and use our tillage other times in the rotation. Okay. Jeannie has thought about this data and talked about this data a little bit more than I have. So if you guys have questions, I might, since she's here, let Jeannie kind of answer those. But here's my take homes. Unfortunately, few new products, lots of new regulations and more to come. Just a friendly reminder to be proactive about herbicide resistance management, and then to strongly encourage folks to think about how strategic tillage would fit into your operation. You guys know your operating budgets. You know what that trade-off is between weed control and the yield losses that we showed up here on these slides. So with that, this is my contact information. Jeannie can get a hold of me. Aaron can get a hold of me. If you're on social media, I am on Twitter and try to share things there. And then I do have a podcast if you like to listen to those. We talk to all kinds of weed scientists about all kinds of topics. So opportunity to learn some things there. I have probably talked long enough. Aaron probably wants to come do his thing on the weed control guide, but questions? Yes, ma'am.
Have recommendations on village depth for going on that? There's any studies been done on that?
I have not seen any studies on depth, and you're actually the second person today to ask that question. So that'll be something good to look at going forward.
You know, I always think on windmill grass, majority of the roots are in like the top,
Right.
2.5 inches.
Yeah. I think I put that on the slide back there. Yeah.
You know, we always joke about windmill grass is that it's so shallowly rooted that it spends the majority of its life not stressed. Because it's just sitting there, you know, not very deep, and so it's always looking for moisture. And so, you know, when I think about this, when I'm in the field, I sometimes just take a shovel and flip them up over, and just, you know, and a majority of those roots are right there. Part of it is, I always think about, is that having something to flip it up to get those roots exposed, while undercutting, I think is a good thing. Anything that we can do to just get those roots more exposed are really, you know, kind of the key to some of that. So,
Especially thinking about like the recommendation that I hear Lucas talk about is to do these tillage operations with pickers so you can, in the hot, like August, July timeframe, and dry those roots out. So, but that sounds to me like the Missouri version of washing your cars. A good way to make it rain when you count on that. So,
and we're not, I guess the other part of this is we're not going to do the.
yeah.
I told this why it's on the side of some of these living. Go in and do something along these lines, you know, we talk about strategic tillage, you know, Sarah did a nice job talking about how the wheat, we're not really showing that response in, but we are showing it in the sorghum, so it's not a single year type of effect that we're seeing that strategic tillage showing up. So you can keep the majority of the field, the no-till side of things, and then just work a little bit around the outside just to get it all back. Because truly, you know, you watch them roll, they roll into the edge of the field, get caught in the residue, and they're sitting there just dropping seeds. So, you know, there's instances where they're a lot further out there, but most of the time, they're kind of in that outside couple of swipes around. So we get a lot of questions on windmill grass, which is why I asked Sarah to talk about it today. And part of, you know, where the strategic tillage portion of this comes in is there just something that we can just hit the edge, knowing that we've got a problem out there in the field and just trying to get a control on them. So, and
I think to me, the secret sauce is, like you said, being kind of proactive about it, right? And hitting it routinely, somewhat routinely, before it starts to creep out into the field, just keeping it from moving. So, okay. I'll be around. Thanks for your attention. You guys were a good group tonight. I appreciate it.